Hello, if you're joining us on Clubhouse, welcome to the Hive Think Tank. We're so excited to be talking with you guys today. We are doing a very cool new thing. We are going to be casting this on Clubhouse and on Zoom webinars today. So if you are joining us in on Clubhouse, please be aware that this is a listening only event. We are reserving questions to Zoom. And if you guys are listening in right now on Zoom, we love questions. We want you to ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen that you're going to want to press, and that's how you're going to ask our presenters the questions. So real fast, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about who I am and about the Hive and the Hive Think Tank before I pass the virtual mic over to today's moderator. Hello, welcome. I'm Maddie Watt, and I am the Senior Manager of People and Programs at the Hive. The Hive is a venture studio, and we are focused on building data and AI-based enterprise companies and startups. And we are proud to also host the Hive Think Tank. And the Hive Think Tank is an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, corporations, thought leaders, and we are an event and content platform, and we are bringing you events pretty much every week. So if you want to find out the latest and greatest about what we're doing, please go ahead and find out more at hivedata.com and click the Hive Think Tank to find out more. Without further ado, I want to pass the mic over to Vinay, who is today's moderator, because we have an incredible panel of investors who are going to teach us all about what the heck deep tech actually means and what are we looking for in that investment space. So without further ado, take it away, Vinay.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Those of you who are on Clubhouse as well as on Zoom. Really excited to be here today. We have a very exciting event. We're going to be talking about deep tech, what that means, exciting technology trends in the space, and for those of you who are founders in the audience, some tips for you on raising capital for your businesses. So as Maddie noted, we're live on Clubhouse and on Zoom. If you do have questions, please feel free to chime in the Q&A at the bottom right of your screen and type them in, and we'll definitely get to them either in real time or at the end. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and start with intros? I'm happy to go first. As Maddie said, my name is Vinay Iyengar. I am an investor at 2 Sigma Ventures. We are an early stage venture capital firm. We are affiliated with a very large hedge fund based in New York, also called 2 Sigma. It's about a $60 billion asset manager, one of the largest hedge funds in the world. We sort of think of it as a technology company. Most of our employees are engineers or have advanced degrees in areas like machine learning or distributed computing. And so given that heritage, we have been interested in sort of early stage cutting edge technology, what many may consider deep tech, for a very long time now. We're investing out of our first sort of outside independent fund. We are not a corporate or strategic fund, but we leverage our hedge fund parent to help out our companies in a variety of ways. Our fund is around $300 million. We're focused on seed through Series B investing. I focus largely on enterprise software, and in particular, what I call data-driven software, so applications of machine learning and AI, or often products that sell to a developer audience. And I'm based in San Francisco and excited to be here. And also just wanted to once again thank Ravi and thank Maddie for having us and for organizing this event. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ashmeet first. If you could give us an intro on yourself and on Engineering Capital, that would be great.
Hi, Vinay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. Very excited to be here today. I run Engineering Capital, which is a seed stage venture capital firm focused on investing in software companies that are taking technical risk. That's a form of deep tech, and we'll get into the different types of deep tech later today. I'm typically the first investor in companies where if you describe what the company is doing, it's not obvious how they are doing it. And so there is technical risk in the products being built. And obviously AI is a huge theme these days.
Faran or Ravi, go ahead.
I'm Faran Nouri, and I'm Managing Director of Lam Capital. It's the venture arm of Lam Research. We are corporate investors, early stage investors. We're a deep tech company of sorts ourselves. We're a semi-capital equipment company, and we invest in startups, early stage startups that are very strategic to the company. Our mission is to go bring innovation from outside into the company, and we look for innovations that are very high impact to the way that we do our business or design our tools or manufacture them or support them. So they have to be technologies that are highly differentiated and have high barrier to entry. So high impact, we look for those high impact technologies to bring those kinds of innovation to the way we do our business.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Vinay, for moderating. My name is TM Ravi. I'm the founder and managing director of the Hive. We've been around since 2012. We're on our fourth fund. And so in 2012, we had a point of view that data and AI is going to drive transformation across the enterprise and a broad set of industries. And so with that sort of perspective, we created the Hive. The other unique aspect about the Hive, and I note with some interest that each one of us has a very different type of venture capital entity. And so we are what is often in the industry parlance called a venture studio. So we collaborate with entrepreneurs and in many cases with corporations to start companies. And very actively involved with them for the first year and a half or so. Our last kind of point, in addition to the Hive here in Silicon Valley, which is focused on US-based companies, we also have a separate Hive in Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, and if things go well, very soon covering the Middle East in Saudi Arabia. Thank you, guys.
Awesome, Ravi. Thank you for that. And thanks everyone for their great intros. Sounds like we have a lot of both overlapping interests, but also some divergence as well, which is always great. So with that, I would love to sort of open up this question of sort of how do you define deep tech? What exactly does it mean to build a deep tech company, and how does it differ from your traditional business? And why don't we start with Faran? I think you have great perspective from Lam, which, as you noted, is in and of itself a deep tech business. So would love your thoughts on that.
So by deep tech, we are looking when we don't specifically say we're going to go invest in deep tech companies. What we look for, and it turns out to be deep tech, is companies that are addressing some really big problems. They're solving high impact problems, using technology and science. So these are companies, again, we look for high technical differentiation. These are once you solve them, there's generally not a question of what market size is, because these are hard problems that if you solve them, there are many applications for them. They tend to be platform technologies that can be applied to multiple verticals. They tend to be companies that have very high barrier to entry. Our own business model is based on very high barrier to entry. So, high value problems. By necessity, that often becomes something that takes a very long time to solve, so you need to be a very patient investor that it works with the company and the team and spend a lot of time and money until this matures to a point that's scalable or commercial ready.
PM or Ashmeet, do you guys want to chime in as well on how you define deep tech?
Ashmeet?
And by the way, feel free to just jump in whenever. No need for me to call on people.
Okay, I'll jump in and add to what Farhan said, which is, one of the interesting aspects about deep tech investing is that often these problems are known. They are large problems and the markets are very large. We just don't have a good solution for them. So the other aspect it's really important to understand on deep tech is that it does mean different things to different people. So for example, materials is often considered deep tech, or battery technology or robotics may be considered deep tech over here. I personally happen to focus only on software companies. And sometimes people are surprised when they say, well, software, what's deep tech and software? And so maybe I can give a couple of examples of software companies where people don't really have a good answer. The simplest example, of course, these days is data privacy, data management. Those are very, very hard problems in computer science. We are approaching it from a legal perspective, political, ethical, but also from a computer science perspective, and trying to address some of these issues. And a real specific example, one of my portfolio companies, vFunction, they have built a solution to take legacy applications, perhaps written in Java or C or any traditional programming language, and automatically convert that to a cloud native stack, to be in microservices, auto scale different containers, etc. And when you describe it to people, they're like, man, this is rocket science. I mean, how can you ever do this, right? It would be months and years of manual work for someone to do it in an application. And today we can literally do it in hours, have an application running over there. So there are many different forms of deep tech. And like I said, I happen to focus on the extreme software aspect of that.
So I'll maybe I'm repeating some of the things that you guys said, but I'll go for it. So deep tech in our point of view is typically kind of higher risk because there's significant innovation that is required, and sometimes because it's hard, it can be done. So there's much higher risk. Typically, it takes a lot more capital in the early stages before you can kind of show anything, and so one way to also kind of think about deep tech is what it is not. And so I'll take kind of the notion of shallow tech, which is, any sort of, there's a lot of startups that are focused on business model innovation. So I wouldn't think of that as deep tech. A lot of take kind of the entire sort of ERP space that's moving to the cloud and enabling SaaS applications. We don't think of that as deep tech. There's a lot of mobile enablement, e-commerce enablement. So those are generally not what I would think of as deep tech. And so maybe a specific example there is a kind of moving ERP style application to the cloud doesn't qualify. But when you start leveraging kind of sensors, mobile data, and overall kind of data and AI, and help drive sort of process automation, process optimization in that particular kind of business process area. And that is kind of leveraging kind of data collected from various sensors, as well as kind of from the activity of people, and really driving a next generation of whatever it may be, CRM or whatever. Practically, if you think about it from CRM is, Benioff's CRM is the same CRM that you had in the 80s. It just moved to the cloud. So that's my thought here.
Yeah, I like that perspective a lot. And I think I would agree. I think it's about sort of all the things you touched on, taking deep technical risk. As you said, like in sort of Peter Thiel speak, startups are trying to go from 0 to 1, and they're doing so either by innovating on a business model or innovating on technology. And so I think of deep tech companies as the ones that are not really taking a business model risk in your sort of great CRM example, like a deep tech company or a company that's moving the CRM from on-prem to the cloud is doing something that's sort of already been done. But I think that the technical risk companies that take more time to build a product that really hasn't been built before, hasn't existed in any sort of form, like that's sort of what I think of as technical risk. And I think another thing folks alluded to that I think is interesting is this idea of innovation in both atoms and bits, right? This combination of software and hardware that we often see in the deep tech world that I think is another really interesting sort of differentiation that a lot of deep tech companies innovate on. So great perspectives all around. I guess another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, specifically in regards to deep tech, is your guys' opinion on sort of what deep tech innovations or technologies or trends you think will be most transformative over the next, call it, decade, or sort of whatever time horizon you want to think of. But I'm curious about sort of what technologies you guys believe will be sort of most transformative.
I'm happy to take a crack on that if I can jump in here, but I do want to add something to the previous question because it was such an interesting place to start the conversation and perhaps also answer one of the audience questions which just came in with the following test that I propose. If somebody says, is this deep tech? Here's a very simple test you can apply. And I think Ravi's example of ERP would also qualify for that. And the test is, if I was to grab a great engineer from Google or Twitter or Facebook and tell them the problem, would they know the answer? Especially in the case of software. Now, obviously, if you're innovating in hardware or semiconductors, or you would have to grab a good engineer from that domain. And perhaps that's the more general version of the test, which is a good engineer should not know how you are able to solve that problem. To me, that's a deep tech question. That's interesting. There's some innovation there. You've solved a problem. And Dave poses one of these questions. He says, is it possible to have data-driven software that respects the confidentiality and privacy of customer data? If so, how? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Of course it's possible. We can do it mathematically using techniques like homomorphic encryption. Unfortunately, those are not commercially viable, right? It's just way too slow to make a real business out of it. And so the deep tech challenge for venture capital, for entrepreneurs and startups is, can you do this in a way that is commercially viable? Again, I don't want to be a shill for my portfolio companies, but I have a company, Baffle, which is doing exactly a subset of this problem. They can run SQL while the data is encrypted in an existing database. So the DBA cannot see the data that is in a SQL database while you are running regular, traditional, enterprise-style databases. And they use a technique called SMPC to work on that data. So these things are possible. And that's what makes it so interesting. And the last point I want to make on this is, the reason it's so interesting is that it gives you as an entrepreneur, in other words, the startup company, an unfair advantage in the market. Because if you can crack a problem like that, you can build an amazing company. I mean, I was an early employee at VMware, and I used to run around telling people, hey, here's a problem on which there are academic papers published which claim it can never be done. An x86 chip cannot be virtualized. Would you like to see a demo of some running software? That's a nice deep tech example.
Awesome, Ashmeet. That's great. That's a really, really good point. And I guess follow up to that question around sort of technologies that you are particularly excited about these days. Do you want to take a crack at that one too?
I didn't want to hog the conversation, but clearly AI is going to be absolutely transformative. And there are lots and lots of challenges in AI. We've reached a tipping point. We've seen some early success. I think AI for the next 10 years is going to define the future of software in many ways. The second is this problem of cyber. We could argue that World War III has already started. Just take an example of the SolarWinds hack. We don't even know what parts of our government, of our corporations, of our data is already in the hands of these hackers. So that's an enormous technical challenge, which I think is amenable to technical approaches. There are other approaches you could take, but is also amenable to technical approaches, and are just two areas that I'm excited about. The last one I'll mention is the end of Moore's law, right? I mean, it's clear that Moore's law is ending. it's clear that we are going to reinvent the entire underpinnings of computer science, all the way back to, is von Neumann the right approach? Is the Harvard architecture the right approach? All the way up to, how do we build our applications and what do we optimize for? And so lots of opportunities for technical innovation and deep tech companies to emerge.
I would say, since you brought up Moore's law, and we think of Moore's law as our domain, the semi industry, which I really think of as the backbone of all the hard tech, is amazingly resilient, and it keeps inventing itself, and in different ways we make that computational power available. It may not be silicon based, but back to your point, Vinay, in terms of technologies that are going to be transformative. I mean, it's, as we watch the Perseverance rover, you think about space inevitably, and billionaires want to die on Mars. But, in terms of my own things that will impact most of us, space may be long-term, the large impact, but I've been given the COVID and watching my aging parents during COVID. That's been something that's been really on my mind. So I've been really focusing on ways that we can maybe in terms of autonomous vehicles or human-machine interface really impact the way all of us live, especially as longevity gets ahead of quality of life to some extent. Can be, how will our lives be transformed by cobots, autonomous vehicles, human-machine interface? I watch my parents' mobility really limited in the age of isolation during COVID, and would love to see us augmented by, artificial limbs and such, so to some people that may be scary to augment ourselves as humans, but I'm all for it, for better quality of life, to the extent that it brings better quality of life as we live longer.
So we have believed since late 2012, when we had lots of naysayers, that data and data-related approaches, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, natural language processing, so on and so forth, AI is going to change the world. It's going to change our lives. It's going to change our health. It's going to change enterprises. And I would say largely, and especially I would say post-COVID, most people in virtually every industry believe that, and so I think the first and probably this kind of past decade, there was a lot of work done in simply doing kind of fundamental work in these technologies, and we see sort of this next 10 years where there is still a lot of deep tech work to be done, but it is more applied. And so I see that sort of, that notion of deep tech, not quite being kind of science or kind of fundamental kind of research, but not sort of like Ashmeet said, not sort of just hacking the engineering part, but sort of somewhere in between. And I see this whole decade of that. And to the point that Faran, you made, I mean, health, life sciences and biotechnology, I think battery technology has so many use cases, ability to have kind of batteries with large storage and that are lightweight, quantum, augmented reality, I think new materials, especially in this world of sustainability that we have, there is a big push to come out with new materials. So I think there's a lot of exciting new areas, and that to the title of our panel today, that are driving the future.
Yeah, that's great points all around. I think one thing you said, Ravi, that particularly resonates is this idea of sustainability and climate change. As I think about sort of the biggest problems facing our society over the next decade and certainly over the next century, it really is climate change. And I am super excited about all the different deep tech approaches that are going to address this issue. And I really do think it will take, as all of you described, traditional deep tech innovations to solve this problem. And in particular, I think about sort of better batteries, better storage, better renewable energy sources, so improved photovoltaic cells and hydroelectricity. And then finally, I think one of the big ones is this idea of improved carbon sequestration technology. I think if we're going to fight climate change effectively, we're going to need to effectively be able to capture and store carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere. And so that's not sort of an area of deep expertise for me, but it's certainly the area of deep tech that I'm personally most excited about. But sort of switching gears a bit back to this idea of AI, which I think we're all really, really excited about. I think AI is obviously transformative. We've seen one thing that's interesting is sort of this commoditization of the core AI technology. If you think about sort of Google open sourcing things like TensorFlow, a lot of the core technologies are sort of out there in the open for people to play around and use. And I think building a great AI business today is much more about how do you apply those tools that are already out there? How do you find a proprietary data set so you can build a great model? So I'm just curious, as all of you have sort of touched on this idea of AI and data-driven software, what are some of the either domains you think AI can be best applied in, or sort of general tips for those who are trying to use AI to solve a problem? Like, where is there the opportunity here?
Maybe I can jump in. So I'll give you kind of a few areas. We broadly sort of apply it to a whole set of industries. So I'll take one which we focused on in 2014, which is moving intelligence to the edge, to kind of devices, to your mobile phone, to industrial assets. And so that was a kind of contrarian approach, because Google, Amazon, Baidu, Microsoft all felt that all intelligence, all compute, all analytics, all intelligence should be in the cloud, and devices should be dumb devices. I think the device manufacturers and the asset vendors thought differently. and also there is kind of issues around economic feasibility of sending all this data. Just think about a camera and the amount of data a camera generates. And is it really viable in a camera in a car to send all of that to the cloud? So there's a whole set of kind of problems that have to be solved there, because resources are highly constrained. And you have to be able to make, the good thing about being on the edge is you can take kind of closed loop responsive kind of actions. And so whether it's a camera in a drone or an industrial asset that's getting kind of IoT type device data. So that's one area I would say is so kind of deep interest. The second area I would say is, and Faran and I are involved in a company that is doing this, where they have a different and a new notion of a digital twin. And if you think about sort of in 2012, as we were doing things, other people also started seeing the promise of deep learning and AI. And they developed a point of view that AI can solve all problems too. And so they tried to create these digital twins that can mimic an industrial process or an industrial asset. And the challenge there is that the amount of data that is needed in order to build a model that can deliver any kind of meaningful outcomes, it could take years, it could take a decade to have that kind of a model in operations. And so the application of sort of physics and physics-based simulation that is used for designing a lot of processes and assets combined with data and AI models can really deliver a kind of an order of magnitude different type of outcomes. And then I'll also sort of support what Ashmeet said, which is privacy risk, especially around cloud applications, and kind of where APIs are being used to string together a lot of services is, in our opinion, kind of a very interesting area.
I want to jump in because of some of what Ravi said, and really agree that both in terms of digital manufacturing, applying AI to transforming the way manufacturing and design is done, as Ravi was talking about, but also in terms of the compute at edge, to really bring full power of AI to the edge. We have one of our portfolio companies, Mythic AI, and many others are trying to deal with the question of compute at edge and solve that problem. So you truly have this smart devices that can locally and without using a lot of power, essentially doing the inference or whatever it is they're trying to solve at edge, and truly enable that smart devices around us.
Just building on the theme of AI, I can give several examples of some very hard and interesting problems, which I think will be solved in the next 5 to 10 years, which is sort of the average venture ecosystem, and yet are deep tech in the sense that we don't have good solutions for them. One of them is the fact that most AIs are incredibly brittle. They are sensitive to the training data. They do not change. When you retrain them, sorry, I have my dog going off in the background here. This is a live broadcast. There's someone at the door, I think, that's going on. So sorry about that. How do you keep an AI, once you've trained it, know that the inference that you got is valid, know that it hasn't drifted, know that it hasn't been maliciously impacted because of the inference data itself that was presented to it. So these are very interesting technical problems where there's academic research going on, but also commercial applications which have to think about it, because I don't think these problems can be solved in the general case. You can't just build a general purpose AI till we solve the AGI problem, which I think is still far away, till we have an AGI working for us. So we will have to come up with some commercial insights applied to technical insights to say, aha, here's a way in which we can run AIs in production, not just for running ads or optimizing something quote unquote simple like that, in things which are mission critical, where maybe your life depends on a decision that is made by an AI.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ashmeet. And I think it's, as you noted, I think a lot of the problems today aren't necessarily about algorithms, but they are about infrastructure, right? How do we get really good, well-labeled training data to build models? How do we ensure that we have good data pipelines and good systems in place to support models that are running in production. And then to sort of the point I made earlier, I think a lot of the interesting opportunities come sort of at the intersection of AI and what I would consider sort of mission-driven problems. So if entrepreneurs are able to apply AI towards things like solving issues in climate change, or solving sort of issues in healthcare around sort of better diagnostics, I think that's where a lot of the really exciting sort of applications and therefore I think a lot of the really exciting companies are going to be built.
I guess a plug of a book. Ashmeet said AGI, so I highly recommend this book for people who are wondering what the heck is this AGI.
Looks good.
That's awesome.
Since we're talking about books, I think this is also a very interesting book, which talks about what's going to happen in terms of how we should think about intelligence and where the future will go. Jeff is a very thoughtful person who actually goes all the way to the very root of, how do our brains work? How do neurons work? What is the way in which organic intelligence works, and then applying it to inorganic intelligence, sort of trying to, make those connections and some learnings over there. So these are all unexplored territories. And what's so exciting about it right now is that, again, we have work going on all the way from philosophers to academics to, research labs to true commercial in the ground venture startups who are trying to make money next quarter, based on what they've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ashmeet, we briefly chatted about this at some point earlier, but I want to get people's perspective, particularly on the role of China in AI development. And speaking of books, there's an awesome book called AI Superpowers, I think, by Kai-Fu Lee, which sort of talks about the rise of China in recent years as sort of the new AI superpower. And I think the data suggests that in terms of funding for venture-backed startups, in terms of patent filings, and in terms of sort of peer-reviewed publications, China is at the same level, if not exceeding the US when it comes to sort of AI innovation. And on that note, curious, maybe we can start with Ashmeet, your perspective on China, and then also on sort of CFIUS here in the US and how that's impacting sort of the interactions between China and the US on this front.
I'm definitely not an expert on China, even though Kai-Fu Lee and I worked together at SGI. It was my first job after Stanford. I mean, he was a senior guy. I was a junior person, but I do know him, and he's a fabulous thinker, absolutely an amazing thinker, no question about it. I haven't read his book. I'll check it out. But we can certainly make some general observations, which I think would apply to China also. Number one, I'll go out on a limb and make a prediction. World War III will be a war between AIs. Okay, if you can think of World War II as a war between machines, right, driven by humans. I mean, that was the big invention by Hitler, was, Blitzkrieg and sort of this whole notion of mechanized war. And World War I was, literally people with horses and humans. World War III is going to be a war of AI. So AI has massive impact, massive geopolitical ramifications. Imagine, you can change an election in a country by changing an AI. That's a fact. We all believe and accept that today. So there are these huge geopolitical, ethical, legal, social, psychological, ramifications of AI, all of which apply to China in the sense that they're a very large country, well run. You can argue about their values or their morals, but they're very efficient in what they do. It's unquestionable that they are. And it is also unquestionable that they recognize the power of AI. So I remember visiting China, I think it was maybe over 10 years ago, and I was just chatting with one of the local officials over there. And, of course, it's hard to tell exactly who's commercial and who's government, and those distinctions are less sharp when you are in China. And he just casually threw out, and he said, yeah, one of my goals is, the number of PhDs that I graduate. And I was like, whoa, I don't think there's anyone in America sitting there going, who has a metric, who's being measured on how many PhDs does he graduate. So, they have a different way of working. They're clearly going to be an enormous power. They have already successfully cleaved the internet. So we don't think about it in those, we don't talk about it in those facts today. But when the internet started, it was a single internet. Everybody accessed the same thing everywhere. Today, that's no longer true. If you're in China, you have a different internet. If you're in America, you have a different internet. And yes, there's a little bit of overlap, and there are some things you can do in common. But the most important things, the most critical elements, whether that's accessing a political idea or some critical piece of information, even the history that you read on the internet is different. The history of the world is different if you view the internet in China versus if you view the internet in America. So all of these things are going to have an impact. And ultimately, it will come down to the thing which always drives change, which is what is the intention of the human being who is driving that decision. In other words, we used to have President Trump. We now have President Biden. They have Xi in China. It comes down to what do they want to do. In which these massive geopolitical changes will take place.
I would add, Vinay, to what Ashmeet just said, but it's not beyond the software and AI. There is the hardware component that China has been doubling down on developing, and particularly after the last administration, when the Chinese government thought that they need to be more independent and doubling down, developing the entire ecosystem of semi-ecosystem themselves. And today in China, we have more startups than ever before, and there is more funding than ever before. So they're here to stay, and CFIUS is causing a lot of the Chinese money that was funding startups in US to go get redirected back into China. So as a result, some of the companies in US are not getting the funding that they could have enjoyed, and more money. There's a lot of cheap money in China that's for the local companies, which will, the combination of all the PhDs that Ashmeet talked about, plus the funding and support from the government, that's a powerful combination, both on the software and hardware piece.
I see it's deep tech happening not just in if you think about sort of the shallow tech, think about like consumer companies and enterprise SaaS. There is a kind of a concentration of those companies in the US and most often from Silicon Valley. And they were able to sort of rapidly scale here in the US. And then it was like to reuse Ashmeet's thing, it's a blitzkrieg. They just dominated Europe and everywhere else just because they had that scale. Think about kind of how e-commerce and others have sort of done that. In a deep tech company, I don't see that kind of exclusive sort of dominance of US. And it's not just China. We see, I go to France often, I see a lot of kind of European companies, a lot of UK-based companies. I see companies, we have a Hive in Southeast Asia based in Malaysia. I see a lot of interesting work in materials, for example, coming out of Malaysia. And I think there is a kind of, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is a cultural reason, which is people have been doing kind of fundamental research and science in many of these countries. The second is that here in the US, our focus, much like in public companies and private companies, has become very short-term, tip of the nose. We're just so impatient to sort of get these going, and deep tech takes time. And third is, I think in some of the other countries, you see kind of government money, research lab money, sort of more kind of prevalent. And like the French government is willing to kind of, over many years, support kind of a startup and give them sort of grants and funds and so forth. So I, not just kind of China, I do see deep tech happening in other places. On the CFIUS thing, that's kind of a whole interesting area. It's the biggest characteristic of CFIUS is that it's not directed to China or anybody, and they can just bring it on you at any time. And so it, everyone knows that it is directed to China, and so creates a lot of risk for companies. We had a company that was getting acquired by a Chinese company, and at some stage they decided they just couldn't deal with all the complexity. So it creates a whole big mess out there.
I want to add one very important point. Sorry,
go ahead.
I want to add one very important point to all the observations that Ravi made about, the globalization of research and entrepreneurship, and the fact that companies are created all over the world now, which is certainly true. One of the reasons for that, and this is a question that's in the Q&A also, is that there are aspects of deep tech that are very capital efficient. In other words, require very small amounts of capital. There are certainly aspects that require high amounts of capital, and I would say that's the dominant case in deep tech, where you do need large capital and long periods of work before you can develop. But there is a subset, especially in software, where because you have access to information, and software is an amazing thing, right? It has infinite leverage. It has zero friction. You can distribute it with zero marginal cost. It's this incredibly powerful and amazing material that we have invented. And you can write software anywhere. You can be sitting in Ukraine, you can be sitting in the Philippines, you can be sitting in America. You are just as productive as the IDE sitting in front of you. You really don't have any intrinsic advantage when you are writing software where you are in the world. And I do believe entrepreneurs have exploited that very efficiently to build some interesting companies where they have been able to be capital efficient. Just because most of deep tech takes a lot of capital, don't forget, the original kernel at VMware, it was a handful of people who wrote that, right? I mean, it's a 50 billion, $100 billion company today. And that's all it took. PageRank at Google was written by 2 people. So, today they employ hundreds and thousands of people to work on those algorithms. But the real work, all the way to where you start commercialization, can be done with a very small number of people, even in deep tech. And that's what gets me so excited as a venture capitalist and as an entrepreneur.
Really great point. Really great points all around, and I'm sure we have plenty more to discuss here on this front. But I know there was an audience Q&A about this, and I know we wanted to leave some time to specifically talk about fundraising advice for entrepreneurs. We're all venture capitalists here, so I think it would be a shame if we didn't, discuss some tips for those who either are currently entrepreneurs starting a company, or those who may be thinking about leaving their jobs and starting a company in deep tech. And I think specifically what we should discuss, and I'm happy to start it off, is this idea of, if you're raising money for a deep tech business, what are the best practices? What are the tips? Are there any sort of metrics or key KPIs that you need to hit to show a VC that you sort of deserve investment? And sort of my perspective here to start off is, I spend a lot of my time, similar to Ashmeet, focused on software-only companies in the deep tech realm. And broadly speaking, in the world of software, there are sort of 2 categories of businesses. There are companies that are competing in already existing categories. Think of what Ravi described as shallow tech companies, your typical B2B application software business. And I think for a company like that, the KPIs really do matter, because showing that you've sort of nailed the go-to-market process is really important when an investor is giving you money. So things like hitting $1 million of ARR and showing really rapid growth and an effective sort of conversion from, ability to acquire customers through paid channels. Like, all of that is very important for sort of your shallow tech SaaS company. But when I think about the sort of metrics that I, as an investor, want to see for a deep tech company, I think it really comes down to having just 1 or 2 referenceable customers who have used your product or are willing to use your product or have an LOI to purchase your product. I think that is sort of enough of a signal that people are willing to take a bet on you. And often the buyers, if you're selling to an enterprise, the buyers are in many ways willing to risk their career on sort of the product or service that you've built. And so when I think about sort of at a high level, what do you have to do to raise money in deep tech? I think it's less about certain metrics or KPIs, and it's more about proving that there exists a market for the product that you're building. And I think the biggest pitfall I see entrepreneurs run into is they spend all these years developing this really complex technology. And as we noted, deep tech takes a long time to build. And they do that without any sort of market validation that people actually are willing to buy their product, or that a market exists for what they've built. And so I think the number one thing I would encourage those of you who are building companies to focus on is this entire idea of building your startup in the lean way, the lean startup methodology. And I think it's possible even for deep tech. So as much as possible, if you can validate that there exists a market for your product, and if you can build as little as possible to validate that, I think that's the best step. And as soon as you sort of start to hit those milestones of customer validation, you can continue to build out your product. But I think it's all about the small steps and being as lean as possible in the early days. That's sort of my perspective, but maybe I'll turn it over to Faran first. Would love your take.
Yeah, we are sometimes quite early investors and may invest in a company. And again, we're more hardware than software. We've co-invested with Ravi in a very, very exciting software company that we think could change the way we design our tools. But in general, we invest a lot in hardware as well. And we do that technical diligence a lot of times ourselves. So for us as early investors, we don't necessarily expect to see another customer validating the technology, but the expectation is for any entrepreneur to be looking at solving the problem that's important. And I mean market there's a market for it. So there is that alignment of very difficult technical problem you're solving for it's well aligned to an important problem that you were solving. So for us, sometimes we're not necessarily looking for another customer, but we know what that market is going to be. Oftentimes for us, in these deep tech companies, we really focus on the team, looking at who the team is, where they are, what their background is, what do they have the capability to, and the technical chops to address solve the problem they're going after. Oftentimes there is some existence proof. We run proof of concept with those technologies if they're very early on to essentially understand the technology, but often that technology is not quite there. We still know that there's a good core in there. The team is very capable, but then, we expect a few years to get to the market or to get to a product. So I would say, if to just summarize it, I would say we look at the team very carefully.
The best advice I can give to founders of deep tech companies, and by definition, these are technical people, that's why they are starting these types of companies, is to pitch your company exactly like you would pitch it if it was not a deep tech company. At the end of the day, companies are measured based on revenues and profits and growth. And it doesn't matter where you get your unfair advantages from. So you have to connect the story to that. And that is helped tremendously by following approaches like Vinay suggested, a lean startup approach, perhaps iterating on the customer side very quickly. Yes, those are all best practices. They apply as much to deep tech companies as they apply to, quote unquote, shallow tech companies. And so from a pitch perspective, you really need to be able to describe your company as a business. That's the job of an entrepreneur, is to build a business. Deep tech just happens to be one of the mechanisms by which you can get an unfair advantage. You could get it through some other mechanism. Other companies are built with other ways. This is just one of the ones that you use.
Not sure if you have anything to add, Ravi, but I think
not really. I think these two covered it. All three of you covered it very well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the one thing that I would add that, at least for me personally, helps when I'm being pitched by entrepreneurs is to not assume I know more than I do. Just because we're deep tech experts certainly does not mean we are PhD level experts in anything. And so again, best practice when you're pitching, assume you're pitching to someone with a second grade knowledge. It's okay to start off really simple. And I often see one of the most difficult things, or one of the things entrepreneurs struggle with, is explaining complex ideas in simple ways. And I think that's one of the most important characteristics I look for in an entrepreneur, is this clarity of thought, the ability to explain something complex very simply. Because if you can nail that, you'll be able to hire people effectively. You'll be able to sell your product effectively. It really is about telling a story at the end of the day and getting people really excited about the vision. So with that, why don't we take some of the audience Q&A? I know we have some really interesting questions. Maybe we can start with David's. I know some people, some of you already addressed this, but are there maybe some examples of interesting deep tech companies that you've seen recently, or maybe that you've invested in? Maybe a good chance to plug some more portfolio companies.
Everything we invest in is deep tech. We haven't, we have, we recently with Hive invested in Geminis.ai, which is, a digital twin company, which we think has a lot of potential to change the way we design design tools. We have invested in a company, Mythic AI, that addresses compute at edge, which can be very transformative for bringing IoT a very usable way, smart devices on edge. We have a company in life sciences that's is synthetic biology that could potentially change the way we expected to do that, the way you manufacture pharmaceuticals. So, we have companies in additive manufacturing also that will change the way you manufacture and supply chain. We talked about geopolitics, and a lot of companies want to localize supply chain near them, and additive manufacturing can be a real powerful tool in that sense. So I can go on, but I will stop.
Anyone else want to chat?
I gave a couple of examples already, so maybe I'll add a little bit of color on the word limited funds, which is in David's question. I think it's important to define what we mean by limited in a world of infinite liquidity and lots of capital. Here in Silicon Valley, I think of capital efficient or limited funds as somewhere in the $1 to $50 million range, as being a small amount of, relatively speaking, a small amount of capital. That's not an immaterial amount of capital. That's still a significant number on an objective basis, but relative to the amount of money that a company may raise or build something, 1, 5, 10, 20 million is a small amount of capital. Lots of companies have been built with that. And the other thing which I would add in terms of capital is, especially for software companies, the 2 pizza rule works really well. In other words, you should be able to feed your team with 2 pizzas. And that's roughly the size of the team that it takes to build these interesting companies. So that's another way of thinking about, how much capital do I really need to solve an interesting problem?
Very cool.
I couldn't agree more on the capital efficiency part, which is, and that's always a little bit of a dilemma for a deep tech company, which is, the VCs are used to, enterprise SaaS style companies and the metrics there, but it is really critical for an early stage deep tech company to be able to show kind of customer metrics. Otherwise, because you can't really expect VC to go and look at the technology and the different risks and how much has been addressed. It's just too complex.
Yeah, awesome. Good points. I think we had a couple questions that were about this idea of a black box in AI. Maybe we can just talk a bit about sort of, what do we think about the sort of explainable AI market? Whether we think, this is interesting, and whether it sort of counts as a deep tech challenge. And this can be sort of our last audience Q&A. And then I think what we can do is, I'm happy to share my contact info in the chat with all the panelists and attendees. And so if you have sort of questions, I know there was one question in the Q&A that was specifically addressed to Faran. So if you have, other questions that you want to chat with us about, I at least am more than happy to chat. And I'm, Twitter DM probably is the best way to reach me. I'll share my contact info now. So, feel free to follow or message me there, and I'll let the other panelists do the same. And yeah, we'll end on this note of sort of black box AI and our thoughts on this space.
I'll just jump in and maybe quick thoughts. So So in many domains, when a model sort of recommends an action, people don't want to just blindly follow it. They want to know why. And that's one aspect. The second aspect is there is a lot of potential for bias and other things in AI algorithms. And so this whole notion of kind of explainability and is critical, I would say, in a whole range of domains. If you're in advertising, maybe it doesn't matter, but it does matter in many domains.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting problem of, when we are running these AIs, as we are getting them into more and more industries and use cases, we are getting ultimately to life critical decisions being made by an AI. And so to be able to predict what the prediction will be, in other words, to understand, what is the AI and why is the model reaching that decision, is a very important problem. I personally believe we are a long ways away from that. We can predict the A part of it, the artificial part of it, in terms of what did the model do and where the numbers were and what weights, which neurons lit up in your neural net. That part we can do. But to predict the I part of it, the true intelligence part of it, I think we are still a long ways from that because we don't understand intelligence yet. That's why books are being written to describe, what is intelligence? Where does intelligence come from? So I think we're a long ways from that. And perhaps that's even not interesting to a venture capitalist today. In other words, it's really a research topic or a science topic and not a commercial topic. But that's just my initial guess. If somebody has a commercial solution to it, I'd love to see it and would be thrilled to invest in it, because I think it would be the first real company to address that, above the layer of companies like Fiddler Labs, et cetera, which are, addressing the state of the art of explainability today.
Fantastic. Well, I think we'll wrap things up with that. I want to once again thank all of our awesome panelists today for being here with us. These were some really, really, thorough and interesting answers, and I think it's just the start of hopefully some really interesting conversations. And so once again, for those of you who are in attendance, feel free to contact us if we can be helpful to you at all. As you can probably tell, we love chatting about this stuff. And then, of course, I want to thank Ravi and Maddie again for organizing this great event. And I look forward to many more awesome Hive events in the future.
Thank you, Vinay.
Thank you, Vinay.
Faran, Ashmeet, and especially.
Thank you all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you everyone for joining us on Clubhouse and Zoom today, and we hope to see you next Thursday. I will drop the link again, and if you're listening on Clubhouse, you can find us at hivedata.com. Thanks guys, thanks everyone. Thanks to our amazing speakers.